Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapters 16 through 31 in our continuing study of the historical books. We've seen chapters 1 through 7 in 1 Samuel, the rise of Samuel, the last of the judges and adopted as something of a priest by Eli. Next, we saw the rise and rule of Saul, although when we come to chapter 15, he's still ruling. He's not going to stop ruling until his death at the end of chapter 28. And so chapters 16 through 31 will be the rise of David, but also eventually the fall of Saul. In a sense, we could call Samuel, all of 1 Samuel, yes, the first part talked about Samuel and Saul's not there, but we could talk about the entire book as the rise and fall of King Saul. And when we get to 2 Samuel, we'll probably call that the rise and fall of King David, even though he's still on the throne at the end of that book. But we'll wait until we see there. Now, Saul and David are therefore in contrast here in this book. We've seen Saul, he's from the tribe of Benjamin. David is from the tribe of Judah. Saul is first seen looking for his father's donkeys. When we first see David, he's going to be caring for his father's sheep, a very mundane job. In the case of Saul, he's head and shoulders above the rest of the men of Israel. In the case of David, he's the youngest, he's the least impressive of 8 brothers. He's nothing to speak of. Not that he's ugly or anything like that, but he's not. He doesn't look like king material. In the case of Saul, God's spirit is removed from Saul at chapter 15 because of Saul's sinfulness, and then we look in chapter 16. We're going to see the spirit of the Lord coming mightily upon David. In the case of Saul, an evil spirit comes from the Lord and terrorizes him. We're going to look at that in just a minute. In David's case, his playing will cause the evil spirit to depart from Saul. So their early references are a study in contrast. That's what I want to see. So chapter 16, verse 1, we have David appointed and anointed, but I meant to say anointed by Saul. He leaves, by Samuel. Samuel leaves Saul after that episode with the Amalekites, and he goes now to Bethlehem, but he does it undercover because he knows if word gets out that David has been anointed, that will put David's life at risk. Might put Samuel's life at risk too, but David's life will definitely be at risk. Remember Saul, when he had been anointed, he kept it secret. So now Samuel is also seeking to keep it secret. He goes there presumably to offer some sacrifices, but while he has Jesse and his family, Jesse is the father of David, he calls for the brothers to come. The firstborn, he thinks that's going to be it, and God says, no, don't look at his outward appearance. I have chosen who it's going to be. And he goes for all the brothers, and it's none of them. And he says to Jesse, is this all there is? And Jesse says, I forgot one. It's David. He's out keeping the sheep. And so David is called in, and that's the one that God has chosen, and Samuel anoints him. In chapter 16, verse 14 now, an evil spirit comes on Saul, and word gets out that David is something of a musician, and David is now he's brought in to calm Saul through music, and at the playing and singing of David, the evil spirit leaves. Now, when I say evil spirit, I don't know that he's demon possessed or anything like that, but it's something that's troubling him. Sometimes you're troubled, and that's, like a satanic thing. Sometimes you're troubled and you're supposed to be troubled because you're doing wrong things. And that had maybe been the case through Saul. When we talk about an evil spirit, that's not necessarily morally evil. It could be just an evil to make him feel bad. Because sometimes you're supposed to feel bad, and that can drive you to repentance. Now, we come to chapter 17. That's going to be the Goliath incident, chapters 1 through 53. Of course, you know the story where the Philistines are assembled and they've got their army, and Saul has gone down to meet them with his army, but they're not fighting. And instead, the Philistine champion, his name is Goliath, he is head and shoulders above everyone else. Wait a second. There was somebody else who was head and shoulders above everyone else. That was Saul. The Masoretic text, that is the Hebrew text, the commonly accepted text of the Hebrew Bible, says that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit is like the length from your fingertip to your elbow, about 18 inches. Now that would put Goliath at like 10 feet tall. I've never seen anyone 10 feet tall. We do did have a student. I think he might have graduated recently, but a student that was 7 feet tall, maybe seven and change. He was big guy. I mean, I don't usually look up to people. I'm 6 foot myself, but I got a crick in my neck looking up at him. Well, here in the Goliath narrative, in the Hebrew text of the what we call the Masoretic text, he's 10 feet tall. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it read there in the description of Goliath slightly different. It said he was 4 cubits in a span. That would be like 6'8", 6'9", still really tall, but maybe not 10-foot proportions. You say, which is right? Are the Masoretic texts of the Hebrew Bible or the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Hebrew Bible? They're both Bible. One's a lot older, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Which one is correct? And my answer is I don't know. I'm just going to say Goliath was a really big guy in any case. And so David he volunteers to go out and meet him, and he goes out with his sling. Now, oftentimes we say, yes, just like a slingshot. Well, actually, a sling, it has two cords, and you're able to throw a stone. Slings were actually used in the military of some armies already at this point, and much later we're going to see the Assyrians will have a whole contingent of slingers. So yes, this is, I guess we could call it light infantry, as opposed to Goliath, who's coming with all the best of the best when it comes to weaponry. Remember, the Israelites, for the most part, didn't have weapons. Remember the story with Saul and Jonathan? They had weapons, but nobody else did. Saul offers David to take Saul's weapons, and David says, a little bit too big for me. And so instead, he goes out with his sling. And notice David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. Well, that's three different weapons. Probably has an armor bearer to hand them out to him. A sword, a spear, and a javelin, one for jabbing, one for cutting, one for throwing. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. And you know the rest of the story. With a sling, he throws the stone, and he hits Goliath in the forehead and stuns him. Goliath falls, and David runs up and makes use of that sword. He takes the sword of Goliath and cuts off Goliath's head. Now, we read in chapter 17, verse 54. Usually we've stopped reading the story of David and Goliath by the time we get here. This is sort of the aftermath. And we read that then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was not a Canaanite city. I'm sorry, it was a Canaanite city. It was not a Jewish city at this point. So I'm not sure that this happened right then, or maybe much later. I suspect that's it, because later on we have another reference to Goliath's head, and it's not in Jerusalem yet. So this is where it probably ended up. But notice he put his weapons in his tent, and we're going to see one of his weapons later on in the tabernacle where that's being kept. But this idea of Goliath's head being brought to Jerusalem, there's maybe a play on words here, because here's the Hebrew for Goliath, but notice if I put the heap of Goliath, it's Galit. I don't know if that sounds like a word you might be familiar with. Galit means the heap of Goliath. I don't know where in Jerusalem he took the head. We're not told. But there's also a place. Now, the Hebrew word for skull is Gul-Galet, which again sounds a little bit, both of these actually sound a bit like the term Golgotha, which in the New Testament will be described as a place where Jesus is crucified. It's around the area of Jerusalem. And people have hypothesized, was he crucified? Was it called that because it was shaped like a skull? Now, the New Testament never says that. Here, maybe it was called that because this is where the head of Goliath was taken and sort of gave the name to the place. There's a similar place in Rome, also known as the place of the skull. Now, it's not in Hebrew; it's in Latin there, and the way you say that is Capitoline Hill. But it means the place of the skull, not because it looks like a skull, but because when they were first building there, they found a skull and it was deemed to have historic importance. And so the skull gave name to the place. And that might be the case. Now, don't be dogmatic, but it might be the case here as well. Now, the story of David and Saul now, in chapter 16, we had David given God's spirit, and we had Saul where the God's spirit departs from Saul, and he's given an evil spirit. Now in chapter 17 with the Goliath incident, we have David facing Goliath in faith, and he has victory, and everything is good. Whereas Saul, earlier in that chapter, we read that he had feared Goliath. Israel was quaking, and Saul was sort of afraid too, even though he was head and shoulders above everyone else. But now that David has won the victory, we see that David becomes very popular. He's loved by others, even those of Saul's family. For example, early in chapter 18, Jonathan meets up with David, and the two become just best friends. Jonathan really admires David, and I think maybe it was mutual. Jonathan seems to be quite a bit older. Remember, he had been around, he had been in some battles earlier, had won great victories. Now David is the hero, and not only is David Jonathan's hero, but also the women in the city, as David and Saul go out and continue their military operations, they begin to sing a song. And the song goes, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now, everybody loved the song. It became number one on the hit parade, except one person. Saul didn't like the song because it put David as higher than Saul, and Saul begins to grow jealous. And Saul tries to do some things. He offers his oldest daughter in marriage, and that doesn't work out. But then his younger daughter, Michal, is absolutely infatuated with David. And so they're actually going to get married, and Saul does that to try to trap David in maybe a relationship, or he's trying to control, do what he sees as damage control. Finally, Saul tries to murder David and to have him killed, and it's getting worse and worse. So chapters 19 through 21 are David as a fugitive. In chapter 19, David flees from the presence of Saul. Saul takes a spear and tries to run him through. David escapes. Next, he's assisted by Michal, his new wife, the daughter of Saul, where Saul sends men to go and kill David. And Michal makes turns the bed, puts some pillows under it and things like that, and makes it look like David's sleeping there, while she lowers David out the window. Apparently it was some sort of two-story home or multi-story home, out the window so that David escapes, and then the assassins come in. They stab the bed, but David's not in it. And so Michal has helped him to escape. Next, David is assisted by the Lord, where Saul gets his horses, and he's coming after David, and he's about to catch him. And all of a sudden, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul. We had an evil spirit before. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and he begins to prophesy. And it sounds like, now we're not given a detailed description, but it sounds like this is almost like uncontrollable, where God comes and he begins to prophesy, and instead of chasing David, he goes along the way prophesying. I don't know what he was saying. Maybe he's saying things that are going to be glorifying to God, and how God is going to use David. I don't know what he said. But the point is that David is assisted by the Lord in this. We come to chapter 20, and David and Jonathan now meet up secretly, and they make a covenant with one another. And they go through the formalities, and they make promises. They go their ways. And now David, and by this time David is starting to get a following. He has others that are loyal to him, maybe family members, maybe others that are following him. And so it's David and his band. Think of Robin Hood and his merry men. Sorry if you don't get the reference. But David and his men, now they're on the run. So remember, these are farmers and shepherds, and they're not at their farms, and they don't have their sheep. So they're getting hungry. So they go down to Abimelech, who is the high priest, at the tabernacle. And they go and they say, hey, can we have some of the bread that's set apart for the priest? Because frankly, we're hungry. And Abimelech, thinking that David, last time he heard, David is Saul's number one man. And so, oh, sure, anything for King Saul. And David doesn't tell him any differently. He doesn't lie to him. He just says, we're really hungry, and we're on a mission. And Abimelech helps David by giving him some of the food that was set apart for the priests. Later on, when Saul comes by, he asks Abimelech, has David been here? And, oh, sure, no problem. We helped him out. Thinking that that's what Saul wanted, Saul gets so angry, he has Abimelech murdered along with a bunch of other priests. That's how bad it's getting. In chapter 21, David flees down to a Philistine city, the city of Gath. Wait a second, that's the city that Goliath came from. And he flees down there, and he pretends to be crazy, insane, and so they take him to the king, and the king says, "What do I need? A crazy guy?" Um, and so they let him go. Next, he goes to Moab. Well, Moab that's on the other side of the Dead Sea. Those are also enemies of Israel. Why is he going to Moab? Remember that David's great grandmother was from Moab. Ruth was from Moab, and so he's sort of and the king of Moab takes the approach. Gee, you're the enemy of Saul. Well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he finds he's able to take his parents there. Remember, there's some Moabite in them as well, and he finds assistance there. We have the pursuit, chapter 22, verse 6, where again David is encouraged by Jonathan, and now Saul is after David, and he's assisted by the Lord's advice, asking which way should I go, and giving, like if I come and hide in the city, are they going to turn me over to Saul? And God's actually advising him on the run. God's helping him to escape. In the second pursuit, there's a scene there where they are down by the Dead Sea, and David is hiding in a cave. And Saul's been on the lookout, and he comes along with a bunch of his soldiers, and they're looking for David. But the day is getting late, and Saul says, "Gee, I need to use the restroom." Well, here's a cave. I'll use that. And the cave that he chooses just happens to be the cave in which David is hiding. And his soldiers whisper, "This is your chance. You can go up behind him. He's like taking care of business. You can kill him. You can cut his throat. You can kill him." And David says, "Shh, I won't do that." And instead, David comes up behind Saul. Doesn't hurt him, but he cuts off the edge of his robe. He cuts off the wings of his robe. Psalm 57 and verse 1, for the choir director said to Al-Tashet, a miktam of David, when he fled from Saul in the cave. Now that's a superscription, but remember the superscriptions they're very ancient. They're in the oldest copies of even the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have. And the psalm begins, be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in you and in the shadow of your wings. Now see the play on words, how he comes up behind Saul and cuts off the edge, that is the wings of his robe. And yet in the psalm, in the shadow of your wings, I will take refuge until destruction passes by. I love the psalm and how it relates to the actions of David. Now, later on, after he's cut the robe, after Saul moves on, David says from far away, hey, Saul, have you noticed anything missing from your robe? Check it out. Look what I'm holding. I could have killed you, but I didn't do that because I've determined not to lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. And Saul, for his part, says, yeah, I was right. I shouldn't have done that. I should, we should be at peace. But things really don't change. And Saul continues to chase after David. And then there's a scene where David comes up to, I think it was in Hebron, and he's assisted by Abigail. Abigail's husband, Nabal, is acting the part of a Nabal. He's acting the part of a fool, and he insults David. David's ready to take him out and kill him. And instead, Abigail comes to David with some supplies and seeks to make reconciliation. Not that he's going to be friends with Nabal, but stops him from committing an act of murder. And David says, "You're right. You're right. I was acting inappropriately. Thank you so much." And later on, Nabal dies. Now, not by David killing him, but just naturally. And Abigail, who's now left destitute, David will come and take her as a wife. I'm not sure if that was necessarily consummated, not sure the story, but just to protect her. And then the third pursuit in chapter 26 is where David this time sneaks into Saul's camp, who's still chasing David, and he takes his spear and his jug. And again, later on, the next day, from afar, he says, "Hey, Saul, take a look what I have. Again, I could have come and killed you, but I didn't." And again, Saul says, "You're righteous. I'm not. I shouldn't have been doing this. I repent." But it's a repentance that doesn't seem to last, or at least David is suspicious that it's not going to last. And so now David goes to the Philistines again, this time not pretending to be anything except himself. And we read that he goes down to Achish, one of the kings of the Philistines, chapter 27, verse 5. David said to Achish, "If I have now found favor in your sight, let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country that I may live there, for why should your servant live here in the royal city with you?" And again, this is the idea: the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so the Philistines are willing, even though he's the one who killed the Goliath. He's killed Philistines before, but they're willing to take him in, and in this case, even to give him one of their smaller cities that's in the sort of in the middle grounds. You know, you've got the cities of the Philistines that are on the ocean, and this one's closer to the Shephelah, the foothills, and so they give him the city. Notice Achish gave him the Ziklag that day. Therefore, Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now, I'm not sure what this day was. I don't know when 1 Samuel was written, but apparently quite a bit later, and it still belonged to them. The number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months, and he gets the city of Ziklag. Now, remember how we mentioned that the Israelites had no weapons because they did not have the secret of smelting iron. That's going to change now, and we're looking at the tell of Ziklag, the ruins. I'm not sure that it's been excavated. Usually they cut away all the tell and they dig into it. But after David rules from Ziklag, after that, we're going to see the Israelites, suddenly they've got weapons of iron. This is the beginning of the Iron Age. It's a very closely guarded secret. What happens? I think that David maybe goes into where they're smelting iron and peeks into this blacksmith shop and says, "Oh, that's how you're doing it." And he takes the technology, after 1 year and 4 months, takes the technology, and eventually that will be given to the Israelites. It's fascinating how God is able to use technology. I'm using technology right here as I'm teaching this class. Now, chapter 28, verse 1. Now it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. They fought against Israel before, they're going to do it again, and they call all the Philistine cities to arms, including David. But now, some of the Philistines, as they're getting ready to march up, and they're marching up to the valley of Jezreel, that's the place where they can take all their weaponry. If they've got chariots, they can use chariots. They can use all the latest technology. That's also the place where you grow the most grain, and I think maybe they're on the lookout for that as well. So they march up to the valley of Jezreel, and the other soldiers, the other kings, start to look at David saying, what's to stop him as we're fighting the Israelites from attacking us, maybe in the rear or subverting us? And so they agree, okay, David, you can go home. You can sit this one out. And David says, wait a minute, I've been loyal. Now, I'm not sure what David had planned, so I don't want to say. But this is God's way of sparing David from having to fight against Saul. And so God is going to send him back to Ziklag. And when he gets there, he will find that there's been a raid on Ziklag, not from the Philistines, but from the Amalekites way down to the south. But that's a later story. Now the Philistines then gathered together and camped in Shunem. That's in the valley of Jezreel, over toward the east. I'm sorry, yes, the east end of the valley. Meanwhile, Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. So they're facing each other across the valley. Look at a picture here. You're seeing Mount Gilboa, and notice to the left of that is going to be the wide open valley of Jezreel. This is where the Philistines are located. They've probably filled up a good portion of the valley as they're getting ready for this final epic conflict. Now, Saul decides he needs some help. He'd like to approach Samuel, but Samuel's been dead for a while. But he hears of someone who's able to do, supposedly, a seance, some sort of spiritualist, some sort of person who's involved in trying to contact the dead. Now, the law very clearly said don't do that. But Saul is desperate, and his desperation will lead him to disobey the law. So notice, Saul disguised himself by putting on other clothes. He's getting out of anything kingly that he's been wearing. And he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. Now, we know where Endor is. We know where the Philistines were. We know where the Israelites. He's actually going sort of behind enemy lines to get to Endor. That's why they're doing it by night. And the woman said, at first she says, I'm not allowed to do this. Saul made it illegal. I can be put to death. And Saul says, no, go ahead and bring up somebody, conduct this seance, contact the dead. I will make sure you're protected. And so the woman says, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. Now, notice the next line, verse 12. When the woman saw Samuel, I think that's what happened. I think the woman actually saw Samuel. Not that seances work. They don't. And I don't think the woman intended it to work. I think she was planning on like putting on a little show and telling Saul what he wanted to hear. But Samuel really does show up. That's what the text says. And when the woman saw Samuel, notice her reaction. She didn't say, okay, now let's have a conversation. She wasn't expecting that. She cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you were Saul. Suddenly she realized she's the one that has been tricked. She's been tricked by Saul. And sort of she's been tricked by God, because that's the only thing that can bring up Samuel. Samuel can't bring up himself. God has to be involved in this. And so the king said to her, do not be afraid, but what do you see? Now this tells me that he couldn't see anything, but she could. And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being. The Hebrew there is, I see an Elohim. You could have translated this, I see a God. Not the God, she can't see God, but something that's a powerful one that she shouldn't be able to see, coming up out of the earth. She's seeing Samuel. And he said to her, what is his form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. Do you remember the last time that Saul and Samuel were together? That time when Samuel had said, you're not going to be king anymore, 1 Samuel chapter 15. And Saul tried to stop him from going away from him and grabbed his robe, and the robe tore. So here he's wrapped with a robe. Now, we're not told it was a torn robe, but he's seen that robe before. He hears that description, and that connects with him. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. And now Samuel makes one last prophecy. He says, as you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath of Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. There's some other things that he's done too, but it's really calling back to that. Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. I don't think that means they're going to be in heaven. I think it means they're going to be dead. The idea of where you go after you die, that hadn't been addressed yet. And Samuel apparently, as far as we can read here, isn't giving him any instructions on that. But I've died, and you're going to be dead too, you and your sons. Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. And sure enough, the next day that's what happens. The battle takes place. We read the Philistines were fighting against Israel. Here you're looking at Gilboa from the opposite direction. Here we're looking toward the west instead of toward the east. And the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. That's what you're looking at. You're looking at Mount Gilboa. So Saul is wounded in the battle. He asks his armor bearer, quick, kill me before the Philistines capture me. They'll torture me. They'll dishonor me. He doesn't want to go through that. His armor bearer says, no, I can't do that, and is afraid to touch his king and kill his king. And so Saul takes his own sword and falls on it and commits suicide. We read, therefore, that Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day together. The Philistines come up, they take the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons, and they mutilate them and put them on public display at the nearby city of Bethshan. So we read in chapter 31, verse 11, now when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead, remember Jabesh Gilead? That was a city that had been sort of pro-Gibeah, pro-Saul. Saul had rescued them. They heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, and all the valiant men rose and walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the walls of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. That was to get rid of the dishonor. That's not a bad thing. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days in honor of Saul. This is a chart. I've been using this for a number of years. Don't remember who came up with it. Seeing the life of Saul, life and kingship of Saul, in 3 acts and in 3 scenes, at least for the first 2 acts. Act 1, Scene 1, we had Saul meeting Samuel and being anointed by him. That was back in chapters 9 and 10. We had Scene 2, where there was success in battle with the help of God, battle against the Philistines, and that was a good thing. Next, we had Saul's failure with Samuel and with Jonathan. Failure with Samuel, remember how he was supposed to wait for Samuel, and instead he engages in the sacrifice himself. And then with Jonathan, he's ready to put Jonathan to death for having not known about an oath and yet been victorious with the Philistines. So not a good story for not on Saul's behalf as well. That's Act 1. Notice you have a meeting, you have success and failure. In Act 2, the same sorts of things happen. You have a meeting where Saul meets Samuel at the conquest of the Akkadians. At the conquest of the Amalekites, but he's disobeyed, and this is the tearing of the robe, and this is where Saul is rejected by God. But then there's success in battle with the help of David against Goliath, against the Philistines in chapters 17 and 18, and then Saul's failure with both David and Jonathan. Saul trying to put David to death, and at one point he even tries to put Jonathan to death for his loyalty to David. So that's Act 2. Again, there's a meeting, there's success, and there's failure. Act 3, again, there's a meeting. This time Saul meets Samuel. We just read about that with the witch of Endor, and his death is foretold. We have not success, but failure in battle, with Saul falling on his own sword. He commits suicide, and that ends this book. But when we go to 2 Samuel, we're going to see not necessarily a failure, but we're going to see David, who will sing a song of lament about the death, not just of Jonathan, but also of Saul. Because David, even though Saul has acted like his enemy, David has done everything he can to remain loyal to Saul. And that reminds me of a greater David who has shown his loyalty to us. Romans chapter 5 and verse 10 says, "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son," and we were, "much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life." Jesus died for us, not when we were being loyal to him, but when we were his enemies. He gave himself for us so that we could be reconciled, so that we could be at peace with God.